An Omega dragged an 80-pound wolf off a cliff, unaware that he was the Alpha King. Alone in the mountains and rejected by everyone, she only wanted to gather firewood before the storm worsened. But as she approached the Forbidden Gorge, what she found in the snow was not just a wounded wolf, it was an impossible decision, capable of sealing the fate of an entire kingdom. Now, surrounded by enemies and secrets, she must choose between fleeing or confronting a past that was never truly buried. Elara was 24 and lived alone in the Cascade Mountains, in the far north of Washington state. As an Omega without a pack, she had learned early on that survival depended not on physical strength she didn't possess, but on the knowledge of medicinal herbs her grandmother had taught her. Her isolated cabin, 15 kilometers from the town of Thornwood, was her refuge from a world that saw her as too fragile to matter. But that brutal winter, an impossible decision would change not only her fate, but that of an entire kingdom. Snow fell heavily on the Cascade Mountains, in the far north of Washington state, covering the ancient pines with a white blanket that seemed to suck all life from the forest. Elara watched from the small, fogged window of her cabin, seeing the flakes dance frantically in the biting wind that howled through the valleys. This was no ordinary storm. In her 24 years of life, she had witnessed many harsh winters in that isolated region, but something in the air carried a premonition she couldn't name. The feeling hung over her shoulders like an invisible weight, causing her fingers to tremble slightly as she brewed lemon balm tea on her wood stove. The cabin where she lived was almost 15 kilometers from the nearest town, a village called Thornwood that served as the last outpost of civilization before the wilderness took over completely. Elara rarely went down there. Her presence caused discomfort among the locals, who treated her with a mixture of pity and barely disguised disdain. Being an Omega was already considered a disadvantage in that rigidly hierarchical society that still followed the ancient traditions of the packs, but being an Omega without family, without protection, and without the physical strength typical of alphas and betas was practically a sentence of invisibility. The women looked away when she passed, and the men made jokes in low voices about her fragility, about how nature had made a mistake by letting her be born so small, so seemingly useless. But Elara had learned, over the years, that strength didn't reside only in muscles or size. She possessed something that many in the region secretly envied: knowledge. Her grandmother, before passing away 5 years ago, had taught her everything about the medicinal plants that grew in that unforgiving forest. Elara knew which roots could heal infected wounds, which tree barks reduced dangerous fevers, and which tiny flowers, when prepared correctly, relieved pains that even the medicines from Thornwood's pharmacy couldn't touch. She survived by occasionally selling her preparations to a few locals willing to swallow their pride and admit they needed her help. The wind shook the cabin door violently, making the latch rattle. Elara pulled her worn wool coat tighter around her body. The pile of firewood next to the stove was dangerously low. She would have to go out to get more before the storm worsened and left her completely isolated. Reluctantly, she put on her worn hiking boots, wrapped a thick wool scarf around her neck, and grabbed her small axe, suitable for her frame of just 1 meter and 60 centimeters. It wasn't the most efficient tool, but it was what she could handle. The Black Forest, as the locals called that dense expanse of pines and firs that surrounded her property, was beautiful and deadly at the same time. Elara knew every trail, every marked tree, every stone that served as a reference. She walked carefully through the snow that already reached her knees, breathing the icy air that burned in her lungs. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackling of snow-laden branches that occasionally broke under the weight. Not even the crows, always present, dared to fly in that weather. She was about 1/2 kilometer from home when she realized she had gotten too close to Raven's Gorge. That gorge was a deep scar in the earth, a precipice of almost 30 meters that ended in a pile of sharp rocks covered in snow and ice. The elders of Thornwood told stories about that place, saying it was where traitors and the weak were thrown in ancient times, when the packs still settled their disputes with blood. Alara always avoided that area, but the storm had disoriented her senses, and she found herself dangerously close to the edge. That's when she saw it. Initially, she thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the snow and the gray light of the late afternoon. But then her eyes focused better, and her heart leaped. Down there, among the sharp rocks at the base of the cliff, was something big. Very big. A dark shape stained with bright red that contrasted brutally with the immaculate white around it. Alara dropped the axe in the snow and crawled to the edge of the cliff, lying on her stomach to get a better view. What she saw made all the air escape her lungs. It was a wolf. But not just any wolf. The creature was colossal, easily weighing more than 80 kilos of muscles and dense fur of a lead-gray tone that seemed almost silver under the snow. It lay on its side, motionless, with several deep wounds visible even from that distance. There was blood, a lot of blood, forming dark pools that the snow hadn't yet managed to cover completely. The animal's hind legs were at an odd angle, and its flank rose and fell in almost imperceptible movements. It was still breathing, but it was dying. Alara should have gotten up and left. Every survival instinct screamed for her to let nature take its course. That animal, by its size and appearance, was clearly an alpha. And alphas didn't need the help of weak omegas. Furthermore, the wounds weren't from a hunt or a common accident. Those were deep, deliberate cuts, made by claws or knives. Someone had tried to destroy that creature. Someone powerful enough to take down a wolf of that size. Getting involved in that could bring a storm of problems much worse than the one falling from the sky. But as Alara looked at the agonizing animal, something stirred inside her chest. She knew intimately that feeling of abandonment, of being left to die because she wasn't strong enough in the eyes of others. How many times had she herself felt like that, lying on the cold floor of her cabin, sick and alone, with no one who cared if she would see the sunrise? That wolf, so big and fierce, was as vulnerable as she had always been. And as much as her rational mind screamed that this was crazy, her heart simply couldn't turn its back. Alara got up, assessing the terrain. The descent would be dangerous. The rocks were covered in ice, and a slip could mean her own death. But she had climbed those slopes before. She knew some points where she could hold on. Running back along the path she had taken, she grabbed her axe and the waterproof tarp she always carried in the emergency backpack she kept in a hollow log nearby. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. The descent took almost 20 minutes of pure terror. Her hands went numb with cold even inside the gloves, and she slipped twice, scratching her knee against the rocks. But finally, her feet touched the bottom of the gorge. Up close, the wolf was even more impressive. Its head alone was bigger than Alara's entire torso. The fangs, visible between the parted lips, were long and sharp as daggers. The claws, even retracted, were terrifying. If that animal decided to attack her, she wouldn't stand a chance. But when Alara approached, trembling with cold and fear, the wolf's eyes opened slowly. They were a deep amber tone, almost golden, and in them was something she didn't expect to see. There was no fury or aggression. There was pain, exhaustion, and perhaps a spark of something that looked a lot like recognition. As if the creature knew somehow that Alara was there to help and not to cause more suffering. The wolf emitted a low, almost imperceptible sound that vibrated in its massive chest. It wasn't a growl. It was almost like a sigh of relief. Alara reached out slowly, letting the animal smell her first. When it didn't react with hostility, she lightly touched its blood-stained fur. It was cold and damp. Examining the wounds more closely, she confirmed her suspicions. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had stabbed that wolf repeatedly, targeting vital organs, and then had thrown it off the cliff, hoping the fall would finish the job. But by some miracle, it had survived, at least until now. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "When you save a life, Alara, you become responsible for it. It doesn't matter how small or big that life is. The universe remembers these choices. Alara took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs, and made her decision. Dragging 80 kilos of unconscious wolf through the snow would be impossible for most people, and Alara knew it bordered on the absurd for someone her size. But giving up wasn't an option she considered. She spread the waterproof tarp next to the animal, working carefully not to aggravate the wounds that were slowly bleeding through the thick fur. The wolf remained quiet, its golden eyes fixed on her with a disturbing intensity, as if it were evaluating every movement, every intention. There was intelligence there, much more than should exist in a common wild animal, but Alara attributed this impression to the shock and exhaustion that was beginning to take over her own senses. With monumental effort, she managed to roll the massive body onto the tarp. Every centimeter was a battle against the dead weight and against the snow that seemed to conspire to keep them trapped in that place. Her back protested, her arms trembled, and tears of pure physical frustration began to roll down her frozen face. But Alara tied the ends of the tarp around her own body, creating a kind of improvised harness, and began to pull. The first step was agony. The second was worse. On the third, she almost collapsed. Climbing back to the top of Raven's Gorge was out of the question. Alara would have to go around the gorge, following a much longer path through the bottom of the valley until she reached a gentler slope that would eventually lead her back to the forest proper, and finally, to her cabin. The distance that would normally take 15 minutes of walking now turned into an epic journey. Each step was calculated. Each movement was a negotiation between her iron will and her body that screamed for rest. The storm worsened around them, and visibility was reduced to a few meters. Alara followed purely by instinct, relying on her deep knowledge of that land that had been her home for so long. 2 hours had passed. Maybe 3. Time had lost meaning, turning into just an infinite cycle of pulling, stumbling, getting up, and continuing. The sky had darkened completely, and only the white snow around provided some visual reference in the pitch black of the night. Alara's fingers were completely numb inside her soaked gloves, and she could no longer feel her toes. Her breath came out in dense clouds of vapor, and her lungs burned as if she were inhaling liquid fire instead of icy air. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Something bigger than logic propelled her forward, a force she didn't understand but couldn't ignore. When the faint lights of her cabin finally appeared through the curtain of snow, Alara almost fell to her knees in relief. But there was no time for celebrations. The wolf was visibly worse. Its breathing had become irregular and shallow, and the blood continued to stain the tarp in increasingly worrying patterns. She dragged it to the covered porch, then ran inside and pushed the heavy wooden table to the side, creating space in the center of the living room, near the warmth of the wood stove. With the last reserves of strength she possessed, she pulled the animal into the house. The cabin, which had always seemed spacious for her alone, suddenly became claustrophobically small with that massive presence occupying almost all the available floor. Alara locked the door, lit the oil lamps that illuminated the interior with a soft golden light, and finally allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. Her clothes were soaked with sweat and melted snow. Her muscles were shaking uncontrollably, and she knew she would pay dearly for this effort in the coming days. But she had done it. Against all odds, she had brought that giant to safety. There was no time to rest properly. Alara quickly changed her wet clothes for dry ones, wearing her warmest flannel nightgown and a thick sweater over it. Then, with precise movements born from years of practice, she began to work. First, she needed to clean the wounds to assess the real extent of the damage. She put water to boil on the stove, prepared clean compresses of cotton cloth, and gathered her medical supplies: calendula and comfrey tinctures, propolis ointment she had made herself the previous summer, sterilized needles and thread for sutures, and bottles with plant extracts that had natural antibiotic properties. Working on an animal of that size was unlike anything Alara had ever done before. She had treated injured rabbits, a young deer that had fallen into a trap years ago, even a lost dog that appeared at her door once. But this was another magnitude completely. The wounds were deep, cutting through layers of dense muscle. There were 3 main stabs, one on the left flank that luckily had missed vital organs by centimeters, another on the right shoulder that explained why the animal had difficulty moving, and a third on the ribs that had left a bone crack that Alara could feel under her trained fingers. Okay, here's the translated text, adjusted for clarity and natural flow in U.S. English. While she worked, carefully cleaning each wound with boiled water and applying the medicinal preparations, Alara spoke softly to the wolf. Not structured words or complete sentences, just a constant, comforting murmur, the kind her grandmother used when she was a child and sick. She talked about the smell of pine trees in the spring, how the deer came down from the mountains when the snow melted, about the stars she could see from the porch on clear nights. Anything to fill the heavy silence and maybe bring some comfort to this creature, suffering in stoic silence. The wolf never reacted with aggression, even when she had to put deep sutures in the wound on his shoulder, a painful process that made the animal tense his muscles and emit low sounds of discomfort. But his eyes remained fixed on her the whole time, those golden orbs shining with something Alara swore was gratitude. It was almost 2 a.m. when she finally finished. Improvised bandages covered the main injuries, ointments applied liberally, and she'd managed to get the wolf to drink some water mixed with willow bark extract for the pain and inflammation. Exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, Alara gathered all the blankets and throws she owned and created a nest around the wolf, trying to keep him warm and comfortable. Then, because she simply didn't have the energy to climb the ladder to her loft bedroom, she wrapped herself in her own blanket and lay down on the wooden floor just a few feet from the creature, using a sofa cushion as a pillow. The warmth from the stove radiated gently through the room, and the storm continued to howl outside. But inside that small cabin, there was a strange sense of peace. Before finally succumbing to sleep, Alara looked once more at her unlikely patient. His breathing had stabilized somewhat, becoming deeper and more regular. "You're going to be okay," she murmured to him, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I'll take care of you until you can go back to wherever your home is." The wolf blinked slowly, and she could have sworn she saw something like agreement in that gesture. Then darkness enveloped her, and she slipped into a dreamless sleep. The next 3 days turned into an exhausting but strangely comforting routine. Alara would wake with the first light of morning, feed the fire that had dwindled overnight, and check the wolf's dressings. He remained mostly in animal form, resting in the nest of blankets she had created, but she noticed gradual improvements. The wounds began to show signs of healing, his breathing was stronger, and the gleam in his eyes had returned with more intensity. Still, he didn't try to get up or transform, and Alara respected that boundary without question. She prepared nourishing soups with deer bones she kept frozen in her outdoor pantry, adding vegetables and herbs that aided in wound recovery. Surprisingly, the wolf accepted the food, lapping carefully from the bowl she offered. He also drank water readily, and Alara had begun adding restorative tinctures to the liquid without him seeming to mind. The communication between them had developed in an almost supernatural way. She had learned to read the subtle signs. A twitching ear indicated discomfort. A prolonged gaze meant he needed water. A deep sigh was gratitude. On the morning of the 4th day, Alara was reorganizing her medicine bottles on the shelf when she heard a sound that made her freeze in place. It wasn't the low moan of the wolf that she had grown accustomed to hearing. It was deeper, resonant, almost as if the very structure of the cabin was vibrating. She turned slowly, and what she saw made her heart pound. The wolf was changing. The transformation was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. The lead-gray fur seemed to melt and coalesce. Bones restructured with audible cracks that made Alara wince. And in a matter of minutes, where once there had been a massive animal, now lay a man. But not just any man. He was extraordinarily tall, easily over 6'3", with broad shoulders and defined muscles that spoke of brutal strength even in his weakened state. The fur had given way to tanned skin, marked by old scars, and the hair that fell across his face was a dark silver hue that caught the firelight. But it was his eyes that held Alara's attention. They were the same golden eyes of the wolf, piercing and intense, fixed on her with a mixture of assessment and something deeper she couldn't decipher. And he was completely naked. Alara felt heat rise up her neck and flush her cheeks. She spun quickly, turning her back while her heart hammered in her chest. I'll get you some clothes, she stammered, tripping over her own words as she hurried to the trunk where she kept some pieces that had belonged to her grandfather. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a flannel shirt and a large pair of work pants. When she returned, keeping her eyes carefully fixed on the ceiling, she held out the clothes in the general direction of where he was. Here. A large hand, with long fingers and calluses that spoke of hard labor, took the clothes from her hands. There was a prolonged silence punctuated only by the rustle of fabric, and then a deep voice, raspy from disuse, cut through the air. You can look now. Alara took a deep breath before finally turning and lowering her gaze. He was sitting, leaning against the wall, wearing the clothes that were clearly too small for his frame. The sleeves of the shirt ended well before his wrists, and the pants looked stretched to their limit. But he was covered, and that was what mattered. They stared at each other for a long moment. Alara had no idea what to say. All the questions swirling in her mind seemed inadequate, or potentially dangerous. Who was he? Why had he been left for dead? Who had wounded him? And most importantly, what would he do now that he was conscious and in his human form? She was immensely outmatched by him. If he decided she had seen too much, if he considered her intervention an unwanted intrusion, there would be nothing she could do to defend herself. But it was he who broke the silence, his voice carrying an accent Alara couldn't quite place, something vaguely European mixed with the hard inflections of North American English. You saved me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Alara just nodded, not trusting her own voice in that moment. He continued, his eyes never leaving her face. You dragged me through the snow. Alone. Another nod. Why? The question caught her off guard. Why indeed? Alara searched for words that could explain the inexplicable impulse that had overcome her, but all she could manage was the simple truth. Because no one deserves to die alone and abandoned like that. Something flickered across the man's face, an emotion too quick to be captured, but it left its mark on his golden eyes. He lowered his gaze to his own hands, studying the palms as if he were seeing them for the first time. Most people would have left me there. Especially. He hesitated, then looked directly at her again. Especially in Omega. Alara felt the old familiar pain tighten her chest. So he knew what she was. Of course he knew. Everyone could tell the moment they saw her. The apparent fragility. The lack of imposing presence that marked the alphas. She raised her chin in a gesture of silent defiance she had perfected over the years. I may be an Omega, but I'm not a coward, and I don't let people die when I can help. To her surprise, his lips curved into what could be considered the beginning of a smile. No, he agreed softly. You clearly are not a coward. He tried to move, then winced as the pain from his still healing wounds reminded him of his limitations. Alara immediately moved closer, her caregiver instincts overriding any fear or embarrassment. She helped him settle more comfortably against the wall, adjusting the pillows behind his back with practiced hands. You need more time to recover, she said firmly, falling back into the familiar role of healer that made her feel more in control of the situation. The wounds were deep. You lost a lot of blood. Pushing yourself too hard too soon will undo all the progress. He watched her work, checking the bandages through the shirt, her small, nimble fingers a stark contrast to the massive muscle she examined. "You know medicine," he commented, and again it wasn't a question. "My grandmother taught me," Alara replied, focusing on her task to avoid those disturbingly intense eyes. She knew every plant in this forest, knew what each one could do. I've spent my life learning from her. She finished the inspection and stepped back, satisfied to see that there were no signs of infection. "You were lucky. A few millimeters to the side and that stab wound to your flank would have hit your liver." "It wasn't luck," he said, and there was a hardness to his voice that made her look up. "It was betrayal. Someone who knows anatomy well knew exactly where to cut to cause the most pain without necessarily an immediate fatal blow." The bitterness in his words was palpable. "They wanted me to suffer before I died." Alara felt a chill run down her spine. This confirmed her suspicions that she had become involved in something far larger and more dangerous than she had initially imagined. "Who are they?" she asked softly. "And who are you?" He studied her for a long moment, as if assessing how much he could or should reveal. Finally he sighed, a deep sound that seemed to carry the weight of responsibilities Alara couldn't comprehend. "My name is Alaric Fenwick, and those who tried to kill me are people from my own council, traitors who decided it would be more profitable to eliminate me than to serve under my command." He paused, then added with a tone that mixed irony and resignation, "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Lands." The silence that followed was deafening. Alara felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Alpha King. She had dragged through the snow, treated like a common animal, and was now caring for the supreme ruler of all werewolf territories that stretched from Alaska to Montana, an empire that controlled not just packs, but entire cities, industries, and political influence that reached all the way to Washington, D.C., and he was sitting on the floor of her humble cabin, wearing her dead grandfather's old clothes, completely at her mercy. The next few days were surreal. Alaric, despite his position of inconceivable power, proved to be a surprisingly cooperative patient. He followed Alara's instructions without question, took the medicines she prepared without complaining about the bitter taste, and rested as she ordered with an authority that came purely from her medical knowledge and not from any social hierarchy. It was a strange inversion of the traditional roles that govern their society, and Alara couldn't help but find the situation bizarre. Here was the most dominant wolf on the entire continent, obeying a packless Omega who could barely lift half of what he weighed. But more surprising than his obedience was the way he watched her. Alaric spent hours simply observing her as she worked on her daily tasks, grinding herbs, preparing tinctures, organizing her arsenal of homemade remedies. His golden eyes followed her as she fed the fire, cooked simple but nutritious meals, or repaired a crack in the wall that let in cold drafts. There was an intensity in his gaze that made Alara's skin tingle, as if he were seeing not just her movements, but something much deeper, something she herself didn't know existed. During the evenings, when darkness enveloped the cabin and the only sound was the crackling of the fire, they talked. Alaric spoke about the realms he governed, about the political complexities of maintaining peace between rival packs, about the challenges of modernizing outdated traditions without losing the essence of what made his people who they were. Alara, in turn, spoke about the forest, about the subtle changes in the seasons that only someone who lived in isolation could notice, about the small joys of a simple life lived in harmony with nature. They were completely opposite worlds, and yet they found unexpected points of connection. It was during one of these nighttime conversations that Alaric revealed more about the betrayal that had almost cost him his life. My chief advisor, a man named Marcus Steele, had been questioning my decisions for months, he explained, stirring distractedly in the cup of tea Alara had prepared. He believed I was being too lenient, too willing to negotiate instead of simply imposing my will through force. To an old-school alpha like him, diplomacy is synonymous with weakness. There was frustration in his voice, but also a deep sadness. I trusted him. He fought alongside my father during the territorial wars, helped establish the peace we have now. I thought he understood that true strength isn't in crushing opponents, but in building lasting alliances. Alara listened in silence, processing the revelation that even kings could be betrayed, that power didn't guarantee loyalty. "And the others on the council?" she asked softly. "Were they all involved?" "I don't know," Alaric admitted, and for the first time she saw real uncertainty in his eyes. Marcus had 3 close supporters who I'm sure participated, but how many others were aware of the plan or simply chose to remain silent? That I can't say. He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his golden irises. They took me to a routine border inspection, an area near Raven's Throat. Said there were reports of trespassers. I went like a fool, with only a small escort. It was too easy for them. The silence that followed was heavy. Alara pictured the scene, the sudden ambush, the brutal betrayal by those who were supposed to protect their leader. "But you survived," she finally said, and there was admiration in her voice. "Even with wounds that would have finished anyone else, you survived until I found you." Alaric looked at her then, and there was something new in his expression, something soft and warm that made her heart clench strangely. "I survived because you found me," he corrected gently. "Because a small Omega who should have left me for dead had the courage and compassion to do the impossible." He leaned forward, and Alara found herself caught in that piercing gaze. "You know what this means, don't you? In the old laws, when someone saves the life of an alpha, a life debt is created. I owe you everything." Alara felt her face heat up. "You don't owe me anything," she protested quickly. "I just did what any decent person would do." But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. It wasn't what anyone would do. Most would have turned away, afraid to get involved. She had chosen differently, and now she was bound to consequences she didn't fully understand. Before Alaric could respond, the distant sound of voices carried on the icy night wind made them freeze. Alara rushed to the window, peering carefully through a crack in the curtains. Her blood ran cold. There were lights moving through the forest, torches or lanterns, several of them, advancing slowly but with determination towards her cabin. And then, echoing through the trees, came a shout that made her heart leap. "Northland's Council Search and Rescue. If anyone is nearby, identify yourselves." If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. Your subscription helps a lot to continue bringing content like this. Alara turned to Alaric, panic evident in her eyes. "Are those your men?" He had risen, ignoring the obvious pain in his movements, and stood tense as a violin string stretched to the breaking point. His expression was a mask of concentration, his heightened alpha senses working to pick up any detail that could identify who was approaching. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he shook his head slowly. "I don't recognize the sense, and the way they're moving. It's too organized, too military. A genuine search would be more scattered, more erratic." His eyes met hers, and in them, Alara saw the cold, hard truth before he even spoke it. "It's the traitors. They've come to finish the job." Pure terror flooded Alara's body. She wasn't a fighter, never had been. Her strength was in her knowledge, in her ability to heal and survive, not in combat. And now there was a group of assassin alphas approaching her home, looking for the man she was sheltering. If they found her with him, if they discovered that she had saved the one they tried to destroy, her life wouldn't be worth anything. She would be a witness, an accomplice, an obstacle. They would eliminate her without hesitation. "The hidden passage," Alaric said suddenly, his eyes scanning the cabin. Does this house have any escape route? A cellar? Something? Alara nodded quickly, pointing to a rug in the corner of the room. Beneath it was a trapdoor that led to a small storage space her grandfather had built decades ago, originally designed to store supplies during harsh winters. It had a secondary exit that emerged among the rocks behind the cabin, disguised among the vegetation. She never thought she would need to use it as a hiding place. But Alaric shook his head, a firm and final gesture. "You're going to hide there," he said with a voice that brooked no argument. "When they knock on the door, you open it, act normal. Say you live alone, that you haven't seen anyone. They'll search the house, and when they don't find me, they'll leave." He started to move towards the back door, but Alara grabbed his arm, her small fingers barely able to encircle the solid muscle. "No," she said, and there was a strength in her voice that surprised her. "You can barely walk. You're injured. They'll find you easily out there, and this time, they'll make sure they finish the job." Tears of frustration and fear burned in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "We hide together, or we face them together. But I'm not letting you walk out that door to die alone in the snow." Alaric looked at her with an expression that Alara couldn't completely read, a mixture of admiration, frustration, and something dangerously close to affection. "Stubborn little Omega," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, seeing that she wouldn't back down, he nodded briefly. "Together, then." The trapdoor closed over their heads with a soft click, plunging them into near total darkness. The space was cramped, barely fitting the two of them, and Alara could feel the heat of Alaric's body pressed against hers in a proximity that made her heart pound erratically for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. There was only a small crack between the floorboards through which a faint sliver of light from the lamp that continued to burn in the room above filtered, and through it, Alara could see distorted shadows moving through the cabin, minutes after the heavy knocks on the door echoed through the night. She had held her breath when the men entered. There were 5, maybe 6, their voices rough and impatient as they rummaged through her belongings without any care. Crystals and vials broke, the sound of shattering glass making Alara wince. Years of careful work, medicines that had taken months to prepare, all being destroyed in a matter of minutes of careless searching. But she remained absolutely silent, pressed against Alaric in the dark, cold space of the hiding place, praying that they wouldn't look more closely at the rug that covered the trapdoor. "There's nothing here," a snarling voice finally announced, carrying obvious frustration. "Just an Omega's shack full of herbs and useless junk." Another man replied, his voice softer but infinitely more dangerous. "Marcus said he was seen in this area. Have they checked the surrounding forest?" "We're on it, but the storm covered any tracks that might have been there. If he passed through here, he must have frozen to death days ago." A pause, then the sound of heavy boots moving towards the door. "Let's check the other cabins further south. We can't go back without confirmation." Alara felt Alaric relax slightly beside her as the voices and footsteps finally faded away. But they remained hidden for long minutes more, waiting until absolute silence returned to the forest. Only then did Alaric carefully push the trapdoor up, his strong hands doing the work that would have been difficult for Alara alone. He emerged first, looking around with extreme caution before reaching down to help her up. The scene they found made Alara's heart break. Her cabin, her carefully maintained sanctuary, was in total chaos. Shelves had been overturned, vials were shattered all over the floor, her clothes scattered, the table flipped. They hadn't just searched, they had vandalized with unnecessary cruelty. Alara walked slowly through the destroyed space, her hands trembling as she picked up the shards of a jar that had contained valerian tincture that had taken an entire year to mature properly. It was all ruined. "Ilara." Alaric's voice was soft, laden with guilt. She shook her head, not trusting her voice at that moment. It wasn't his fault. She knew that rationally, But the emotion that overwhelmed her wasn't rational. It was loss, violation of her safe space, the brutal reality that her life would never be the same because she had chosen to save a stranger. Tears finally escaped, rolling silently down her cheeks as she stood in the middle of the devastation, feeling smaller and more helpless than ever. And then strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her against a broad, warm chest. Alaric held her with a gentleness that contrasted drastically with his physical strength, one hand stroking her hair as he murmured words of comfort. "I'll fix this," he promised against her hair. "Every vial, every book, everything they destroyed. I swear I'll replace everything and more." Alara allowed herself that moment of weakness, leaning on him, absorbing the warmth and solidity he offered. And she realized, with a shock that ran through her like lightning, that it wasn't just comfort she felt. It was connection, deep and frightening, with this man who was so different from her in every measurable way. They remained like that for long minutes until Alara finally pulled away, wiping the tears with the back of her hand. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice still shaky but gaining determination. "They'll be back eventually, and next time they might decide to burn the place down just to be sure." Alaric agreed, his expression turning serious and focused. "We have to get to Thornwood. There's a federal communications outpost there. I can send a secure message to my loyal allies, people who weren't involved in the betrayal." Thornwood, the town that Alara avoided, where she was seen as an aberration, an object of pity and ridicule. The idea of going back there, especially accompanied by Alaric, brought a different kind of anxiety. But she knew there was no alternative. "It's a 5-hour walk," she said, already starting to gather essential supplies that had survived the devastation. "And you're still recovering. I don't know if you can make it." "I'll make it," Alaric said with absolute conviction. "I have no choice." He began to help her, collecting what could be salvaged, packing dried food and water into an old backpack. They worked in efficient silence, an unlikely team united by necessity. When they were finally ready, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first light of dawn. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world covered in pristine white that shimmered under the rising sun. The journey was brutal. Even on the trails that Alara knew by heart, the deep snow made every step a challenge. Alaric tried to hide it, but she saw the pain in his movements, the way he occasionally pressed his hand against his injured ribs, the pallor that crept over his face. But he never complained, never asked to rest. His determination was absolute, driven by something stronger than physical pain. It was cold, calculated revenge, the desire to make those who betrayed him pay for their crimes. When they finally reached the outskirts of Thornwood around noon, Alara stopped, grabbing Alaric's arm. "You need to hear something before we go in," she said, and there was vulnerability in her voice. "The people here, they don't respect me. They see me as useless, pathetic, a worthless Omega. If you want to keep your identity hidden for now, you're going to have to pretend to be less than you are, and treat me the way they expect an Alpha to treat an Omega like me." The words hurt to say, but it was the truth. Alaric studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes intense and unreadable. Then, to her complete surprise, he took her hand, his large fingers engulfing hers completely, and brought it to his lips, gently kissing her knuckles. "I will never treat you as less," he said in a low but fierce voice. "You saved my life. You are the bravest person I have ever met. And anyone who can't see that is blind." He released her hand reluctantly. "But I will do what you ask, if that's what keeps you safe." Thornwood was a small town, with just over 1,000 inhabitants, nestled in the valley between pine-covered mountains. The buildings were mostly made of wood and stone, built to withstand the harsh winters that dominated the region for months. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and the air smelled of burning wood and beef stew that some local restaurant was preparing. It was midday on a Saturday, and the main streets were reasonably busy with people doing their weekly shopping or simply socializing in the central square where the farmers' market was located. Ilara's arrival had the expected effect. Curious glances turned towards her, some recognizing her immediately and looking away with disinterest, others frowning when they realized she wasn't alone. Alaric walked beside her, and even wearing simple, ordinary clothes, there was something about him that exuded authority and barely contained power. He was too tall, too broad, too intense to go completely unnoticed. Whispers began to spread as they crossed the square. "Who's that with the Omega? Never seen him around here before. That guy looks dangerous. What's someone like that doing with her?" Ilara kept her eyes fixed ahead, ignoring the comments that reached her ears. She knew the way to the post office and communications, a small brick building at the end of Main Street that also served as the local radio station. The clerk behind the counter, a middle-aged man named Jerry, who had always been minimally polite to her, raised his eyebrows when he saw them enter. "Ilara," he greeted with obvious surprise. "It's been a while since you've come down to town." His gaze slid to Alaric, assessing and cautious. "And does your friend need something?" Alaric stepped forward, positioning himself slightly ahead of Ilara in an unconscious protective gesture. "I need to send an encrypted message, urgent, secure equipment." His voice was authoritative, nothing of the deference that would be expected of someone making a request. Jerry blinked, clearly unaccustomed to such a direct tone. "Well, we have the secure line, but it's only for official use and emergencies." "This is an emergency." Alaric cut him off, his golden eyes fixing on Jerry with an intensity that made the man swallow hard. "And I guarantee you will be well compensated for the inconvenience." He pulled something from his pocket that made Jerry's eyes widen. It was a ring, heavy and ornate, made of intertwined gold and silver, with the crest of the Northlands engraved, a wolf howling at the full moon surrounded by stylized mountains. Anyone familiar with the political hierarchy would recognize that symbol immediately. Okay, here is the English translation of the text, adjusted for a US audience and suitable for YouTube. Jerry nearly choked. You're, he stammered, his face losing all color. "Sir, I didn't know. I never would have—" "Silence," Alaric ordered softly, but there was steel in his voice. "No one can know I'm here. Do you understand? This is a matter of national security." Jerry nodded frantically, already moving to unlock the back room where the most advanced communication equipment was housed. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Anything you need." Ilara stayed near the entrance, watching the interaction with a strange feeling in her chest. Seeing Alaric take command so naturally, seeing how even a tough beta like Jerry immediately bowed to his authority, was a stark reminder of the disparity between their worlds. He was royalty, born and bred to lead thousands. She was a nobody, a rejected Omega living on the fringes of society. For a few days, in that isolated cabin, she had forgotten that fundamental difference. But now it was back, sharp and inescapable. The message took about 20 minutes to send. Alaric used codes Ilara didn't understand, speaking in military and political terms that were completely foreign to her limited vocabulary. When he finally finished, he came out of the room with an expression of relief mixed with tension. "I got through to General Harrison, commander of the Northern Guard. He's loyal and will mobilize trusted forces immediately. They should arrive by tomorrow morning." He looked at Jerry, who still seemed to be in shock. "You will provide us with accommodations until then. In secret." Jerry nodded so vigorously that Ilara thought his neck might break. "Of course, sir. I have a room above the post office. No one uses it. Completely private. I can bring you food and whatever else you need." Alaric agreed, satisfied. Then his attention turned to Ilara. There was something different in how he looked at her now, a softness that wasn't there when he spoke to Jerry. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, just for her to hear. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She wasn't all right, not really. The reality of the situation was starting to weigh on her. In the next few hours, soldiers loyal to Alaric would arrive. He would retake his throne, hunt down the traitors, and return to his life of power and responsibility. And she would go back to her ruined cabin, to her solitary existence, as if nothing had happened. Except everything had happened. She had changed, in ways she didn't yet fully understand. And the thought of returning to that loneliness, after feeling the constant presence of someone who actually seemed to see her, was almost unbearable. The room above the post office was small but clean, with a double bed, a worn armchair, and a small window that looked out at the mountains in the distance. Jerry brought up hot stew and fresh bread, leaving it all on a tray and quickly retreating with more bows than were necessary. When they were finally alone, Alara sat in the armchair, while Alaric surveyed the view from the window, his shoulders tense. "You're thinking about revenge," she said softly, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Alaric didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders move with a deep breath. "I'm thinking about justice," he corrected. But there was a hardness in his voice that confirmed her observation. "Marcus and the others can't go unpunished. If I allow treason of this magnitude to pass without severe consequences, I send a signal that weakness will be tolerated. Others will try the same. And then you become what they said you were supposed to be," Ilara observed quietly. "Cruel, ruthless, ruling through fear instead of respect." Alaric finally turned to face her, and there was clear conflict in his golden eyes. "What do you suggest? That I forgive them? That I let those who tried to assassinate me simply return to their positions as if nothing happened?" He walked over to stand in front of her, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "They left me for dead like an animal, and they would have killed you too if they had found out you helped me." "I'm not saying forgive." Alara stood up, having to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I'm saying don't let this betrayal turn you into the monster they wanted you to be. Judge them fairly. Punish them according to the laws. But don't let hate govern your decisions." She reached out, placing her hand gently on his chest, feeling his heart beating strongly beneath her palm. "The person I saved wasn't a vengeful tyrant. He was someone who believed that strength was in building bridges, not burning them." Alaric covered her hand with his large fingers enveloping hers completely. "How do you always manage to see the best in me?" he murmured, his voice husky. "Even when I can barely see it in myself?" Alara felt tears prick her eyes, but she smiled nonetheless. "Because I know what it's like to be judged only by what people see on the surface, and I refuse to do the same to others." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotions and a tension that had nothing to do with politics or treason. Alaric lowered his head slowly, his eyes silently asking permission. Ilara should have pulled away. She should have remembered the impossible differences between them, the social realities that made any connection beyond temporary gratitude completely unviable. But instead, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft initially, almost hesitant, as if both of them were afraid of breaking the fragile moment. But then it deepened, becoming more urgent, months of loneliness from both sides meeting in an explosion of genuine connection. Alaric's hands went to her waist, pulling her closer, while hers rose to tangle in his dark silver hair. It was perfect and terrifying at the same time, because Alara knew, with absolute certainty, that after that kiss, nothing would ever be the same again. She had fallen in love with the Alpha King, and there was no possible happy ending for a story like that. Morning came too quickly. Alara woke up curled on the daybed where she had insisted on sleeping, leaving the bed to Alaric, who still needed proper rest to fully recover. The pale light of dawn streamed through the small window, and she could hear movement outside, muffled voices, and the sound of horses. The reinforcements had arrived. She sat up slowly, her heart heavy with the awareness that this day would mark the end of the temporary bubble they had lived in for the past few days. Alaric was already standing, looking out the window with a posture that had completely transformed. He was no longer the injured patient she had cared for. He was the king reclaiming his throne. His shoulders were straight, his chin was raised, and there was an authority in every line of his body that demanded obedience. When he realized she was awake, he turned and his face softened slightly. But Alara could already see the distance forming between them. He was going back to his world, and she would be left behind. "General Harrison is here," Alaric said, his voice formal. "With 50 of the best soldiers, we will return to the capital today and deal with the traitors." He paused, then added more softly, "You will come with me. It's not safe for you to stay here alone, not after you've been with me. Those loyal to Marcus might try to use you as leverage." Alara nodded, even though the idea of going to the capital, to the heart of Alpha power where she would be even more out of place than in Thornwood, filled her with dread. But he was right. She had become a target the moment she chose to save him. She quickly packed her few belongings, pinned her hair into a simple bun, and prepared to face whatever came next. General Harrison was an impressive man, well into his 50s, with graying hair and scars that told stories of battles won. When his eyes landed on Alaric, pure relief crossed his weathered face. "My king," he said, bowing deeply. "Thank the heavens you're alive. When we received your message, we mobilized immediately. Marcus and his co-conspirators were arrested overnight. They are awaiting trial." Alaric nodded, grim satisfaction on his features. "Well done, General. And the state of the council?" Harrison hesitated before answering. "Chaotic, sir. Many of the members claimed to have had no knowledge of the plan. Others admitted they suspected but were afraid to act. Trust is broken. It will take time to rebuild." "Then we will rebuild," Alaric declared with conviction. "But first, justice." His gaze met Alara's, and she saw the determination there, but also something more. He was remembering her words about not letting vengeance govern him. "The trial will be public and fair. Everyone will have the right to a defense. But if they are found guilty, the punishment will be severe." The journey to the capital took 2 full days. Alara rode on a gentle horse beside Alaric, surrounded by soldiers whose loyalty to the king was absolute and obvious. They treated her with a cautious courtesy that she wasn't used to, clearly following Alaric's orders that she was to be respected. But she could see the curiosity in their eyes, the unspoken questions about who she was and why the king kept her so close. During the rest stops, Alaric spent most of his time in strategic meetings with Harrison and other officers, planning the restructuring of the government and discussing security measures. But he always found moments to check on Alara, asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. They were small attentions, but each one warmed her heart even as the sadness grew. The closer they got to the capital, the more real it became that this closeness was temporary. The capital of the northern lands, called North Point, was unlike anything Alara had ever seen. Built on the slopes of a massive mountain, the city sprawled across multiple levels, with buildings ranging from modest wooden houses in the lower areas to impressive stone and glass mansions in the upper districts. At the very top was the royal palace, an ancient and imposing structure of gray granite with towers that seemed to touch the clouds. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. As they rode through the main gate, a crowd had gathered. News of the king's return had spread quickly, and people lined the streets to see with their own eyes that Alaric was alive. Cheers echoed, hands reached out trying to touch him, and the relief was palpable in the air. Clearly, despite the conspiracies of the council, the common people loved their king. Alara rode behind him, feeling smaller and smaller as she absorbed the magnitude of what he represented. How had she been so presumptuous as to think she could mean anything real to someone of that importance? The trial took place 3 days later, in the great hall of the palace. Marcus Steele and his 3 main co-conspirators stood chained before the throne, their expressions ranging from defiant to terrified. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Witnesses, intercepted messages, even confessions from some of the lesser members of the plot who had accepted deals in exchange for testimony. Alara watched from a side gallery, partially hidden behind a pillar, unable to look away even when her stomach churned. Alaric presided over the trial with a cold calm that was more terrifying than open anger would have been. He listened to every defense argument, allowed each defendant to speak, and then delivered sentences that were severe, but just according to the laws of the kingdom. Marcus and the other leaders of the conspiracy were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, their properties confiscated and titles revoked. Those lesser involved received varied sentences depending on their level of participation. When it was all over and the traitors were being led away, Alara saw Marcus glare at Alaric one last time. "You're weak," he spat with venom. "I was right. Any true alpha would have executed us. You'll fall eventually because of that pathetic softness." Alaric rose from his throne, descending the steps until he stood face to face with the man who had tried to kill him. "Strength isn't in mindless killing," Alaric said, his voice calm, but carrying throughout the silent hall. "Strength is in having the power to destroy completely, but choosing a better path. You never understood that, Marcus. That's why you failed." He gestured, and the guards dragged the furious prisoner away. The hall erupted in applause and cheers, but Alaric just sighed, looking exhausted to the bone. "Leave a comment below telling me what your favorite part of the story has been so far. Your engagement means the world and helps me create even better content for you." A week had passed since the trial. Alaric had thrown himself headfirst into the work of rebuilding his government, interviewing candidates to replace the traitors, meeting with pack leaders from across the territory, repairing alliances that had been shaken by the conspiracy. Alara saw less and less of him. She had been given luxurious quarters in the palace, with maids assigned to attend to her and access to anything she could desire. But it was a gilded cage, and she felt more lost than ever. The palace courts whispered about her constantly. The Omega who saved the king, they called her, but not always with admiration. There was jealousy, speculation, some even suggesting that she had used some kind of manipulation to gain Alaric's favor. Alara tried to ignore it, but each whisper was a stab reminding her that she didn't belong in this world. She was an outsider, tolerated only by royal whim. It was on a rainy afternoon, while she was watching the rain fall over the palace gardens through her window, that the door opened and Alaric walked in. She hadn't seen him alone in 4 days. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, but still devastatingly imposing in his formal kingly attire. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "I miss you," Alaric finally said, simple words but loaded with emotion. Alara felt tears sting her eyes. "I miss you too," she admitted softly. "But it doesn't change anything, does it? You have responsibilities, an entire kingdom depending on you. And I'm just a cabin Omega who got in the way of history." Alaric crossed the room in 3 long strides, taking her hands in his. "You're not just anything," he said fiercely. "You're the most important person in my life, and I know I'll sound completely crazy saying this after so little time, but I don't care." He knelt before her, this powerful king, making himself vulnerable in a way that made Alara's heart race painfully. "I love you, Alara. I love your courage, your kindness, the way you see the world. You make me want to be better, do better, and I know there are 1,000 practical reasons why this is impossible. But I can't pretend I can live without you anymore." Tears were streaming freely down Alara's face now. "The court will never accept it," she whispered. "They'll despise me. They'll say you've lost your mind, that an Omega can never be queen. They'll plot against us, make your life impossible. Alaric squeezed her hands. Let them try, he said with a conviction that brooked no argument. I've spent my whole life doing what was expected, following traditions just because they were traditions. It almost killed me. But you saved me, Alara. And in doing so, you showed me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is defy expectations. But I don't know how to be queen, Alara protested, even as her heart sang with hope. I don't know about politics, about how to lead. And I can teach you all of that, Alaric replied readily. But you already have what's most important, and what no training can give. Genuine compassion, moral courage, and the ability to see people as individuals instead of just positions and titles. He stood up, pulling her to her feet with him. Marry me, Alara. Not because I'm king and you feel obligated, but because we choose each other, despite everything that's against us. Alara looked into the golden eyes that had become so familiar and dear. She thought of the lonely cabin, the decades of invisibility and rejection she had endured. She thought of how her life had changed completely the moment she decided to drag a wounded wolf from death. And she realized that sometimes fairy tales happened in the most unexpected places and to the most unlikely people. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, with certainty. Yes, I will marry you. Alaric swept her into his arms, spinning her around as laughter escaped from both of them, pure and joyful. When he finally set her back down, he sealed the promise with a kiss that made the outside world disappear completely. The announcement of the engagement caused exactly the kind of scandal Alara had predicted. Conservative members of the court were horrified. How dared the king choose an Omega with no lineage, no wealth, no obvious political value? Petitions were circulated, private meetings were held. Some even threatened to resign their positions in protest. But Alaric stood firm, and slowly, surprisingly, the common people began to speak out in support. Stories about Alara saving the king spread and grew in the retelling. She became a symbol of something larger. Proof that worth didn't reside in status or physical strength, but in character and courage. Omegas from all over the territory sent letters of thanks, saying that for the first time they felt they had a voice, a representative in a position of power. And that wave of popular support was something that even the most rigid nobles couldn't completely ignore. The wedding was held 6 months later, in a ceremony that blended ancient tradition with modern innovations. Alara wore a white silk dress embroidered with silver threads that caught the light like snow in the sun, and a delicate crown of crystals and flowers that had grown in the Black Forest. Alaric stood beside her, magnificent in his royal robes, but his eyes never left her face as they made their vows before thousands of witnesses. I promise to honor you not as my subject, but as my equal, Alaric vowed, his voice strong and clear. I promise to listen to your wisdom and value your opinions. I promise to build a kingdom where everyone, regardless of whether they are Alpha, Beta, or Omega, has the chance to thrive based on their merit and character. Alara felt tears of happiness as she responded with her own vows. I promise to stand by your side in strength and weakness. I promise to use whatever influence I have to be a voice for those without a voice. I promise to love you not for what you are, but for who you choose to be every day. When they kissed, sealing their union, applause echoed throughout the capital, and Alara, who had spent her life feeling invisible and worthless, finally understood that sometimes the greatest stories begin in the most desperate moments. They begin when someone decides that even though they are small, even though they are considered weak, they can make a difference. It begins when courage overcomes fear, when compassion conquers indifference. Years passed. Alara and Alaric ruled together, bringing reforms that slowly but consistently changed the society of the northern lands. Laws were passed protecting Omegas from discrimination. Programs were established to educate and empower everyone regardless of designation. and the voice of the common people began to matter as much as that of the nobles. It wasn't easy. There was resistance, setbacks, moments when it seemed impossible to change centuries of tradition. But they persevered, always supporting each other. And when, 3 years after the wedding, Elara gave birth to twins, a strong alpha girl and a gentle omega boy, it became even clearer that the future would be different from the past. These children would grow up in a world where their worth would not be determined by their designation at birth, but by who they chose to become. The cabin in the Black Forest was restored, transformed into a memorial and center for the study of herbal medicine. Students came from all over the territory to learn the ancient techniques that Elara mastered, and she personally taught classes whenever her royal duties allowed. It was her way of honoring her grandmother's memory and ensuring that that knowledge was not lost. And sometimes, on quiet nights when their duties were complete and the children were asleep, Alaric and Elara returned to that cabin. They sat by the wood stove, wrapped in blankets, and Elara retold the story of how it all began. How she found a wounded wolf and made the impossible choice to save him. How that wolf became a king. How that king became her husband and the father of her children. "Do you ever regret it?" Alaric asked once, holding her close to his chest as the fire crackled. "Taking on this burden? Your life would be so much simpler if you had left me there." Elara looked at him, seeing not the fearsome king who made nations tremble, but the man who loved her with a devotion that still took her breath away. "Not for a second," she replied with complete honesty. "Because that day, when I dragged 180 pounds of wolf through the snow, I wasn't just saving you. I was saving myself too. I was proving that I had worth, that I could make a difference. And you gave me a world where I can continue to make a difference every day." She leaned in and kissed him softly. "You were my destiny, Alaric, and I am grateful every day that I had the courage not to let you die alone in the snow." And so, the story of the Omega who dragged a 180-pound wolf off a cliff without knowing he was the Alpha King became legend. It became a tale told to children on cold nights, a reminder that heroism doesn't require brute strength or a position of power. Sometimes it only requires the decision to do what is right, when it would be so much easier to simply move on. And that true love doesn't see designations or titles. It only sees the soul of the person we choose to protect and honor. Elara lived to a ripe old age, loved by her people and by her family. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, it was in the same mountains where it all began, with the hand of the man she loved holding hers, knowing that she had lived a life that mattered, that she had changed the world, one courageous choice at a time. Thank you for joining this thrilling journey from beginning to end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a comment, sharing what your favorite moment was. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so now, so you don't miss more incredible stories like this one. Until next time.